Work will soon get underway to determine if a new oil refinery could be built in Australia. The federal government is looking at ways to further boost fuel supplies after the Middle East war exposed Australia's reliability on other nations for diesel and petrol. Let's get more from political reporter Stephanie Boris. Hi, Steffi. So what can you tell us about the potential for a new oil refinery here?
Hi Ros. Well, there are just two oil refineries in Australia at the moment. There's one in Queensland and one down in Victoria. If you look a few decades back, there were about 8 of them, but over time they've closed because they weren't economically viable. But as you mentioned there, the war in the Middle East has really reminded Australia and governments at a state and federal level that we are so reliant on other countries to get our fuel. About 90% of our fuel is coming from overseas. So the government today has announced, along with the West Australian government, it will fund a pre-feasibility study in Western Australia, a total of $4 million. And that study is looking into whether it is viable to open up a new oil refinery on the West Coast. If it was to go ahead, it would be the first since the 1960s to be built. And if, there's a lot of ifs here, Ros, if it was to go ahead, it would cost billions of dollars and take some time. So it's not as if a new oil refinery, happens overnight and it helps solve the current problem we're in. This is about future-proofing Australia against future crises. Now, the Prime Minister is in Western Australia for this announcement. His comments made it very clear that he's supportive of another oil refinery being opened up, but it's just a matter of whether the economics and the logistics of it stack up.
Building an oil refinery here on the West Coast would obviously build our resilience as a nation, as well as particularly benefit Western Australia, which plays such a critical role in Australia's economy. So this will be, if it is successful, the first new-scale petrol refinery built in Australia since the 1960s. It would create a major boost for local jobs and manufacturing, along with our sovereign capability. And that's what this whole project and this whole great city is about. It's about building sovereign capability, building resilience, making Australia less vulnerable to the shocks of which we've seen since February 28.
So, Steph, we've seen the cost of fuel increase due to the war in the Middle East. The federal government has provided financial relief to help motorists, but that's due to end on Sunday, isn't it? Is that still the case?
We think so, Ros, but it's still a little bit of a watch this space. So as you mentioned, obviously the cost of fuel has gone up because of the war in the Middle East. The federal government responded by cutting the fuel excise in half. That was in place for 3 months. Then what they did was essentially extend the relief, but at a lower rate. So at the moment, across July, you're getting about 16 cents a litre off what you're paying for your petrol or diesel. And now that's due to end on Sunday. There have been questions around whether it will be extended or changed in some form or another, because the government's wording around this has been a bit vague. Today, though, what we are hearing from senior government ministers seems like they're going towards that, yes, the plan, they're sticking with it, that it ends on Sunday, which means that motorists will see the cost of fuel rise. At the moment, the cost of diesel is more than what you were paying before the war broke out between Iran and the US. For petrol, it's a little bit different depending on where you are. Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, it's actually cheaper than what it was in February, but other capital cities, it's more expensive. So the government's just taking a final look, you could say, at where the figures are and how this also affects the budget. Of course, inflation is something else they have to take into consideration too. So there's a lot of moving pieces at the moment.